Christians on the right love to talk about how society is crumbling because of drag shows and pornography and degeneracy. But when you press them about state violence, about unjust wars of choice and aggression, and about what Romans 13 actually means about governance from the Christian worldview, they get quiet or defensive even. Why is it that sexual sin is always front and center while the sins of the state are treated like an afterthought, if not outright justified? Are we supposed to believe that the biggest threat to our families is men in dresses and not trillions of dollars in debt and endless foreign wars in an empire that spies on and incarcerates its own citizens? I'm not saying morality doesn't matter, but I am saying we've lost the plot.
If Christ is king, how should the Christian consider the kingdoms of this world? What does the Bible teach us about human authority and what it means to love our neighbors and our enemies? Before we render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, let's know what it means to render unto God what is God's. This is the Biblical Anarchy podcast, the modern prophetic voice against war and empire.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Biblical Anarchy podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Winograd. So today's episode, a little weird. I did a live stream and the live stream went impromptu and unplanned. I was supposed to have a guest, but the guest had a scheduling conflict. It was going to be Andrew Wilson, and him and I are going to reschedule and talk another time. But I still talked about what I had prepped to talk about, which is this subject of sexual sin and degeneracy and what our outrage as Christians should be focused on. So I thought it was still it ended up just being a good solo episode that I streamed live. So I decided to just shift gears. So I'm going to transition now to that recorded live stream for you guys to listen to, and then I'll talk to you on the other side. Welcome, everyone. I am Jacob Winograd. I'm the host of the Biblical Anarchy podcast here at the Libertarian Christian Institute. If you enjoy what we do, you can check out our merch store. I have some things in the works trying to push us to have more cool stuff for you guys to get. These little rock glasses here, you can get them branded with your favorite podcast or just with the Libertarian Christian branding, if that's what you prefer. As always, if you want to support the show, you can go to biblicalanarchypodcast.com and donate there, or just go straight to libertarianchristians.com/donate as the bottom ticker shows. So tonight's show, the context is I made some comments back on episode 100. And by the way, I'm just going to do a little congratulatory pat on the shoulder. I can't reach my back. A little pat on the shoulder there for making it to 100 episodes. Not a lot of podcasts last that long and make it to 100. I've technically done more than 100 podcasts. I've probably done more than 200, to be honest. If I added up every Daniel 3 episode, every Biblical Anarchy podcast episode, of course, including the bonus episodes, and every Green Room episode I've done, it's well over 200. It might be approaching, probably not quite to 300, but we're probably close to that. But I don't know, still cool to finally break into the triple digits on a particular podcast. So just keep building from there. I know the flagship podcast is all the way up to, I think they just crossed into 400. So got some catching up to do. But yeah, anyway, sorry to tangent like that. But yeah, so episode 100 was just a casual, impromptu conversation with Cody Cook. And we were just talking about different things, reminiscing about different things we've talked about on our respective shows. And I was talking about just the genesis of biblical anarchy and how I came to it, and just things that I've improved upon, things that I've changed my mind on, things like that, certain episodes that I'm proud of or ones that I'm not as proud of or that had mixed reactions. And I forget the exact context, but we were talking about just the tendency of Christians to clutch their pearls at certain things in ways that make you question their priorities. And I used the Glenn Greenwald controversy as a springboard for this, because that had happened recently at the time of me recording that. And I remember when all that was going on, for the most part, it seemed like people had generally pretty reasonable takes where they were going, okay, like the leaked stuff of Glenn, we already knew Glenn was a practicing homosexual, married. I think he adopted kids, and conservatives and Christians come down. There's, I guess, some nuance along this stuff, but generally, a lot of conservative Christians would say that obviously we believe in traditional Christian norms and really just biblical norms. It's not even about tradition because tradition isn't what guides us, but it just happens to be the traditional view. But that the biblical definition of marriage is between a man and a woman. It's a covenant between them and before God. And this is established in Genesis, reaffirmed by Jesus. And on top of that, we think it's better for, of course, children to be raised by a couple who is married, in that this is the normative operation of how a family operates. And so it's not ideal for the child or for society generally to have children being raised by a homosexual couple. That doesn't mean I don't want to lean too far into this. Some people say they'll make claims like there's higher rates of abuse or there's associated with more negative outcomes. I think with all things, it's compared to what, right? And we got to be really careful, I think, when we generalize and go off of just certain statistics or studies, that we have to look at the methodology and things like that. But certainly, yeah, I think just it has more to do with what's lost than what, and there's some potential confusion that can have there, right? If you're being raised by a homosexual couple, then I imagine you will be raised to believe that is just as valid as a heterosexual couple in the covenant of marriage. And yeah, there's a lot of ways people raise their kids and live their lives. And we as Christians don't agree with all of them and view them as sinful. And we don't necessarily like it or celebrate it when children are raised with beliefs that we think are wrong, but it doesn't doom them. There's plenty of people that come from all sorts of backgrounds, some worse than just being raised by, way worse than being raised by a gay couple, and they come to know Christ, and it's not all determinism. You're not just going to be stuck with the worldview you were raised in necessarily. But yeah, we would prefer, like, it's better for a child's psychology, better for their safety, their well-being, their spiritual health to be raised by a mother and a father. And yeah, so Glenn has adopted children. People aren't a big fan of that. I saw some people say he had used like a surrogate or with IVF, which is a whole other moral quandary. But I think I saw Glenn say that he didn't use that route and they just adopted. But either way, it brought up all of that, right? And yeah, a lot of that is stuff that like conservative Christians to various intensities don't support. Now, I'm a libertarian, and it happens, I think the Christian view and the libertarian view perfectly overlap here, which is that I don't think the state has any right to be involved in marriage at all. And so I don't seek to use force to prevent gay people from living together or, if they want to call it marriage, I wouldn't want to use a law to stop it. But I just want to have the state separated from marriage entirely. Certainly no church should be compelled to perform a same-sex marriage. And I think that beyond that, in terms of like the adopting children and things like that, you can have preferences, and like in a true libertarian sense, you can have market forces that like private adoption agencies would have their own standards and rules, and maybe they would lean one way or the other. But I wouldn't advocate for the initiation of force to prevent children from being raised by a gay couple any more than I would do it for them to be raised by a single mom or single father or anything like that. If there's instances of abuse, that's something that has to get dealt with, no matter what the orientation of the couple raising the child is. And, I would certainly also there's still conversations to be had about abortion and IVF and all this, but generally speaking, it's just the libertarian norm, which I think is also just the Christian norm about governance, is that civil government exists to enforce civil justice. It's there to rule on matters where you have conflict that is more than just, like legal conflict. There's a dispute over property or a dispute or aggression that has been committed against someone's property or their body. And that's where government is ordained to operate, because it wields the sword. And so this deal, I've talked about this many times. Best place to get a full explanation of this and what I'm about to bring up is episode 89, which is a a sort of updated version of the pilot episode, What is Biblical Anarchy? The Principle of Proportionality. And that comes from Genesis 1, reaffirmed throughout also the Old Testament law and later echoed in Romans 13. Yeah, I think that, anyway, that's all review. But so anyway, we were talking about, to pivot back to episode 100 and what we were talking about. So there were people saying, conservatives, and their reaction to this, at least a lot of conservatives were reacting, saying, yeah, listen, we already knew a lot about Glenn's lifestyle, and we don't agree with a lot of his values there and the way he's living his life. And we certainly also don't want to necessarily gloss over the content of what was in those leaked clips and say, I think this gets into, so I don't think it's only gay couples who do weird things and have weird fetishes. And there's that phrase in the common culture, right? You don't kink shame. And I don't know, like, I don't know where I would draw the line between like people having weird preferences or things they like to do in the bedroom to mix things up and spice things up. I don't think, like, I'm a conservative Christian, but I don't think the meme of, first of all, just that we can't even talk about sex and sexuality without blushing and acting like that's some kind of taboo topic to talk about as Christians. I think we should normalize talking about sex more, and especially as Christians, because sex is a beautiful thing given to us by God. We're not anti-sex. I think like purity culture from like the like evangelical Protestant world is harmful. It's honestly what leads to a lot of people leaving the church and embracing more degenerate, if you're going to use that label, lifestyles and engaging in sexual immorality. So yeah, I don't think just because everything has its time and place, right? And so sex should be celebrated insofar as it's being done in its proper time and place, which is within covenantal marriage. And within covenantal marriage, I think there should be a lot of freedom for couples to, like, it's not wrong to enjoy sex with your spouse and to find different ways to engage in that beautiful act of intimacy in ways where you're enjoying what you're doing. There's different ways to do that, right? I don't know where the line is, where I think there is a line where when some people say, ooh, this is what turns me on, this is what I like to do in the bedroom, if for some reason they're sharing that stuff, there's a line where I can imagine some reductio ad absurdums where we would all go, yeah, no, if someone's into that, right? If someone's, I want you to tie me up to where I can't move and I want to be in constant pain and believe, you can go really reductio, like just really crazy. I'm saying it's reductio, but I'm sure there's people that have kinks like that. And you'd go, that's probably a sign that something in your sexual nature has become disordered to some degree. It's perhaps not the right way for human sexuality to be expressed. And insofar as people can cross that line, I don't think that it's impossible for straight couples to cross that line. There's an argument I think people would make, which I think I'm sympathetic to, that if you're already in a disordered space where you have disordered preferences for the opposite sex, perhaps when you're doing that, you are going to then be more, there's a higher proclivity for those who are engaging in disordered sex to have disordered ways of engaging in those sinful sexual practices. And I suppose it's not my area of expertise. People say this is actually just like well documented. And one of those instances where there are certain stereotypes about gay men dressing up as women when doing their sexual activities, which is somewhat stereotypical at the very least. And so, yeah, like I'm open about all that. I think I want to be careful to not overstate things, but I certainly think there's a danger there. All this to say that I think there's room to acknowledge that. But when the real crux of this and what I talked about in episode 100 was that if people were talking about this stuff in more or less a vacuum, I think there's room for that. When these clips are released and being weaponized by the establishment and corporate media and certain people who are banging the war drums, especially for what's going on in Israel and Iran, and they're like going after one of the top journalists in the world who does journalism covering and exposing a lot of government corruption and cover up when it comes to foreign policy, there's something about that's rather transparent. And I think we can talk about things that we think are sinful in terms of the sphere of sexuality and family and human relationships, and even talk about ways in which that can be detrimental to society, but not lose our minds over it to the point that then the minute like these clips are presented to us in a clear, transparent move to discredit anti-war voices, and honestly, these clips are being promulgated and shared and presented to people to discredit Glenn, and you have to ask yourself, like, how many of you have skeletons in your closet that you're not, well, you hear stories, right? I've heard Dave Smith and others who used to work for Fox, for example, talk about all the skeletons in those closets and how those people, they're LARPing as conservatives a lot of the time, and they often are living very degenerate lifestyles in the background. I've heard Lauren Southern talk about this. I'm pretty sure Lauren Southern has participated in a lot of this. So, yeah, I think there's room to criticize that. But in the moment when what is happening is there's a basically right wing and almost corollary, at least establishment left wing, right wing and left wing media frenzy, cancel mob telling us to focus on things that we could have guessed about Glenn already. And now we just have video clips on, which I don't even want to watch. And to then, okay, now we need to start talking about this and having a conversation about sexuality and how degenerate Glenn is, when it's clear that you just want to discredit his anti-war stuff. No, I'm not going to participate in that, because at the end of the day, as much as I think these things are not unimportant to a conversation about having a free and moral society, like there has to be a hierarchy, as I said in the cold intro there, of understanding the degrees of impact and degeneracy amongst different sinful behaviors, both on an individual and more, I guess, collective societal scale. And I'm sorry, but I don't see an argument to say that a gay couple doing what is normal for them, degenerate gay sex behavior, just doesn't even really register in my outrage meter compared to mass murder campaigns being sanctioned and protected and funded by my government with my tax dollars, while they also print a bunch of money that destroys our savings and our livelihoods. And I think that millions of people being killed through a device which is economically devastating, not just America, but the world, leading to economic consequences, which then promote less real production and more like fake pseudo production and bubbles and distortions in the market and malinvestment, which then promotes more reliance on government and more welfare, which then feeds back into the degeneracy problem, by the way, and the problem of hedonism and self-indulgence. But like the Federal Reserve, the way our financial system is structured to prop up the war machine, that's the heart of the beast. All this like sexual stuff in terms of that I laid out in the first 20 minutes here, like that is all way downstream. That is it's not even just a second order consequence. It's like a fourth or fifth order consequence of the main like foundation of what our focus should be, which is far more, and I'm going to talk about the term degeneracy here in a minute, but is far more degenerate than what the clips of Glenn Greenwald. Yeah, I could even make an argument that Glenn Greenwald, insofar as I would say he does degenerate things, but his impact on anti-war coverage is generative enough that you could almost make an argument that maybe it more than washes out in terms of his net impact, right? That he's a net good for society, even though it doesn't make his sins less sinful or him any less of a sinner who needs to be saved and sanctified and to repent. But just in terms of the consequences of his sin, his private sin is not impacting me. His journalism is impacting society in a positive way. So anyway, in episode 100, when I'm talking about this with Cody, I brought up Andrew Wilson, who was doing this freak out about about this and saying to, like, how can there be conservatives defending Glenn Greenwald? And I must be the last sane person on earth and things like that. And just doing his normal stick. And listen, there's some people I know who question why I even talk to Andrew and like Andrew. Eh, I have a certain soft spot for certain on the right wing populist side, and Andrew's one of them. Stephen Wolf is one of them. CJ Engel is one of them. I don't. There's a lot of really important fundamental disagreements. That each one of them has a couple things where I go, I really like this. Same with Glenn, for that matter. Like, I don't agree with Glenn on a lot of stuff outside of war, but I really like his anti-war and anti-empire coverage. There's a couple things that Andrew does that I like. I also think Andrew's just funny. Like, I watch his show because a lot of it is just comedy and performative, and it makes me laugh. And it's kind of like guy stuff, right? And you don't have to like, that's fine, but I do. And so anyway, all that to say, but yeah, I think Andrew does some good things, but overall, a lot of his spiel, like when we had our debate, I talked about this in episode 97, is this sort of like just doubling down on the trying to make you feel icky about something and trying to really like it's what conservatives do and liberals do it, leftists do it in their own way, but trying to play into like your fear reaction or your moral outrage, right? And then we're not acting out of first principles. We're not constructing a systematic theology, a working theory of Christian political action. We're just like, gross thing bad must stop, right? And so must use men with guns to stop. It's not even an argument. It's an assertion based on moral outrage. And that's what Andrew was doing in these X posts, and I just called it out. And then Andrew was upset about me calling it out, or at least saying that I was being silly and stupid and saying it's easy to say this stuff when I'm not here to defend myself. I extended an invitation to Andrew to, fine, you want to come on and talk? Come on and talk. That invitation is open. I invited him to come on tonight. He said he could. I don't know if he's going to show up or not. I'm going to stream probably till about 9:30 my time, Eastern time. If he shows up, we'll talk. If not, the door's still open. Maybe we'll do another time. But I figured I'm going to do a stream tonight either way and talk about this stuff, lay out my case. Andrew, if you watch this later, maybe listen to my entire case. Maybe instead of a convo, we'll do a debate on it. I don't know. But yeah, that's where I'm coming from. That's the premise of what we're talking about here today. I probably didn't need to take 25 minutes to give you a full explanation of it. But yeah, so let's see. I'll read some of the comments here. So Lord of the Rees in the chat. That's 98 more than I or E, IE. But hey, man, doing your own podcast, more power to you. The 90 more than I've been on. Okay, you corrected yourself. Okay. He said the state perverted marriage by getting involved in it. Sure, the state perverts everything. Ultimately, and this was my entire debate with Andrew. Andrew's whole thing is degeneracy. And I wouldn't say I'm not pro-degeneracy. I don't make my entire political and like career of talking about politics and theology online about degeneracy. I talk about it occasionally. Episodes 68 and 69, I think, talk about my sort of like libertarian Christian take on a lot of the LGBT stuff. But even there, I'm often find myself in this middle space between people who I would say are more reactionary towards LGBT stuff than I am. And then, of course, then those who are just affirming or more neutral. Like, I'm not neutral or affirming. I'm definitely opposed to that stuff. But I think that there's a useful hierarchy to how we talk about these subjects and how much time we spend on each subject. So I want to define degeneracy. So degeneracy, and so there's like an etymology to the word, which is I did a deep dive on just to kind of refresh myself last night. And like most words, it means different things at different times, depending on the language, the culture, whatnot. There's some people who really don't like the word because the root of it has gene in it, like our genes. And and there have been different times throughout history, both maybe like ancient history, and then again with like the Nazis and fascists in Western Europe, where they would use the term to mean that like people who are like genetically inferior, right? And so when I'm talking about people who have a certain sexual preferences or engage in certain sexual activities or that have a belief that they have some kind of gender identity that doesn't match their sex, I'm not saying that these are like subhuman people or that we should hate these people. None of the things I'm going to talk about should be interpreted to mean that we should hate or wish violence upon our neighbors who identify as being part of the LGBT community. And that I want to lead with that because, again, there are some reactionaries that I think go too far. But in terms of what I think degeneracy often means today, especially in conversations about this subject matter, I think it refers to actions, behaviors, or systems that corrode individual character and that undermine social cohesion and that obstruct the fulfillment of God's created purposes. And by God's created purposes, I mean like the dominion mandate to steward the earth, to be fruitful and multiply, to cultivate life. And I'd even go one step further from that and say that even like upholding justice and promoting human flourishing and intergenerational flourishing is part of to be generative, right? It's part of the dominion mandate. And degeneracy is anything that works against that. So generally, sin is going to be degenerate. And so in a way, we could say we're all degenerates, especially if you haven't been sanctified or born again before we come to Christ. We're complete degenerates. And when we come to Christ, we are recovering degenerates who are undergoing sanctification. So it doesn't, again, we're not creating subclasses of people here. There is certainly those who have undergone more sanctification or who don't struggle with certain sins more than others. But the important thing here is that sin is always degenerate, but not all sin is equal in degeneracy. This isn't a perfect analogy, but I would say that sin is like the behavior itself, which is to miss the mark, to rebel against God, to be separated from God. And all sin makes us sinners, and the wages of all sin is death. And some people will sometimes say all sin is equal. That's not really true. It's equal in the sense that all sin separates us from God and makes us in need of a savior, makes us all have fallen short, right? But not all sin is equal in its effect and its earthly consequence for you and for those around you. And that's what you could say degeneracy is more like the measurement of the impact of sin on individuals and society. I don't know, that might be like oversimplifying it, but I think that's a somewhat useful way to construct the heuristic. My buddy Cody Cook, Cantus Firmus, the anarchist Anabaptist, the punching pacifist in the chat, said Wilson misses the point because he flattens out sin and assumes that all sin warrants the same response, state violence. Yeah, you know what's funny is that I know because I've talked to Andrew a lot and I've listened to him a lot, and I know he agrees that not all sin is equal in impact. Not all sins are equal in the consequence. Like I've heard him say that verbatim, but and it's not even like I'm not trying to pick on you, Cody. Like it's not true that he thinks that all sin warrants state violence, but he does not have a standard by which he would say, here's the sins that warrant state violence and here's the ones that don't. When I pressed him on this, and when Dave in his debate pressed him on this, he appealed to case law. But case law is just the practice of law, which means that it's people like ruling on specific conflicts and appealing to objective standards of law, right? So you can't have case law without the law, which means you'd have to be appealing to something in objective law and ethics that says, here's the line, here's the standard. You can't have case law without standards, unless your case law is just arbitrary. And at that point, it's not law. That's just, I like the term from Liquid Zulu, jungle ethics, right? It's just jungle ethics if you don't have objective standards. It's might makes right, which is not a Christian view. I might start using the punching pacifist. I like that. I don't believe in intellectual property, but I'm Machiavellian with the state, so I'm going to copyright it and make you pay royalty for it. But putting the fist in pacifist, says Lord of the Ree, or maybe not that. Okay, you guys, you're killing me with the puns now. I pass a fist. Okay. Oh boy, now we're getting all derailed here. By the way, for those of you watching, please give this stream a thumbs up. Subscribe if you like us, like what we're doing here at LCI, like this kind of content, like this kind of shenanigans and dad jokes in the comments. I don't know if Andrew's going to make it. The invite was sent. He seemed down yesterday, but hasn't responded today. That's fine. Not a big deal. I just figured I'm going to talk about it anyway, and I'll give him more to respond to if he wants to. But I'll probably go till 9, and then we'll switch gears and just do some casual talk. If you're free, Cody, and you want to hop on around 9 o'clock, let me know. I'll send you a link. And we can do some impromptu podcasting. We can do our Scooby and Scrappy Doo bit. Alrighty. So I've defined degeneracy, and I want to give more examples. So yeah, I think unrepentant sexual immorality is degenerate, but also then mass violence, wars of choice and aggression, taxation, idolatry of nation and empire, and welfare. These are in money printing, right? These are all things which are degenerate because they reward irresponsibility. They're not being good stewards, right? And they're not, the way I defined it, that it's if we are war undermines social cohesion, obviously, right? At least wars of choice and aggression. I'm for just war, but that's a separate episode. I can only talk about so much in one episode. The money printing undermines our ability to effectively steward the earth because we're distorting value and we're distorting market transactions, which we need to have proper price signals to properly manage the scarce resources of creation. So yeah, all these things are degenerative to different degrees at different times, right? But the point is that they're degenerative. And then there's some things that are probably, I can list, that are degenerative more on a personal scale, right? And even then they might have small impacts. Like if I'm a degenerate with my wife, like if I'm not faithful to my wife, that could affect my kids. But if there was no kids in the picture, like it was just me and my wife and I was unfaithful to her, it does have a small impact on the world around me still, because like it's a bad testimony to the gospel. It undermines the institution of marriage. But for the most part, like it's not creating massive distortions in social cohesion or the ability for others to continue living good lives that are fruitful and multiplying and being good stewards, right? So some are more private and impacting the more degenerate on an individual level, but then other things are obviously going to have wide scale consequences. So I think if Andrew was here, one of the things he would talk about, which there is some truth to, is that the reason we have to oppose sexual degeneracy is because it leads to societal collapse and it does break down social cohesion. And first of all, I would say yes, but we have to talk about the degrees. I think war and central banking and welfare, I think these things are far more destructive. But furthermore, I think that, and I know not everyone here likes Hoppe, but I think Hoppe makes a really good argument in Democracy, the God That Failed, that degeneracy is really a state-sanctioned project of sorts, right? And this is why I like Brave New World over 1984. I like both, but I just think Brave New World is more about where our society is headed. Because if you get into part of degenerate behavior is going to be time preference, right? Like the ability to like in economics, time preference is like in a strict sense when you are able to forestall something you want in the present for something in the future, thinking the thing in the future is going to be better, right, than the thing you can have right now. But that means discipline, right? That means that your preference is a lower time preference, right? A high time preference is called high time preference because I haven't brushed up on the exact way that they describe these things in a while. I think it's a high time preference because you more highly value the things that you can get right now. Whereas a low time preference means that you place a lower value on the things that you want and need right now based on anticipating the future outcomes. Probably a better way to describe that, but that's good enough for what we're talking about. And the idea is that a lot of degenerative behavior is high time preference because a lot of it tends to be indulging on people's desires and like this. It reduces morality in the human realm down just to consent and what feels good. Now, I want to be clear here. The libertarian does not say that people engaging in high time preference behavior is criminal. People can be hedonistic and all sorts of self-indulgence, and they can live lifestyles that we think are not virtuous, but that doesn't mean that it's criminal behavior. So the libertarian says that's not under the jurisdiction of the civil magistrate. It's not under the jurisdiction of law at all. But we as Christians can say we can have these observations about people's behavior and say that they're not conducive to these to the dominion mandate. And what Hoppe says is that the state is, in a sense, a creature of high time preference, right? Because the state predates on current resources and production at the expense of future production. So it's the opposite of low time preference. It's the opposite of generative through taxation, which is not a market transaction. It's theft, it's fiat. And through fiat currency and money printing, that these things are incredibly degenerative by nature, high time preference. And then what that does is there's so many second and third and fourth order consequences to this, right? One of the things is that I'm not going to be able to list all of them, but a couple of the really key ones is that if you have high inflation, that you have disincentivized savings, because unless you were able to invest in like the stock market or in ways in which you can preserve your savings so that it outpaces inflation, that saving money is almost punished because your savings lose purchasing power over time. And so money printing is a degenerative thing, not just in terms of, there's all sorts of things about the Austrian theory and how the Federal Reserve and money printing leads to the boom bust cycle and all this. And that's bad too, right? That can destroy people's life savings. It can destroy people's businesses and things like that. So that's one aspect. But then there's also just the fact that people are more incentivized to spend rather than save and rather than invest. And then the only way we really get investing is by like printing money and just pumping it into the economy, which then leads to that boom bust cycle. But it's not sustainable growth, right? It's artificial and then it crashes. And so it's not actually showing good stewardship over the scarce resources. It's not conducive. It's degenerate, right? And then here's the kicker. This is then fostering in the society a higher time preference mentality because you're no longer thinking about the future. You are being conditioned on a very fundamental societal level to be focused on the present. And so add into that then things like the welfare state, because people are not able to compete in the market as well because of all the distortions. And then the solution to that is bailouts for the big businesses, and that's a form of like welfare for the rich and corporate welfare. And then there's welfare for the poor, right? And there's so many moral hazards to welfare. And I get really torn with welfare as a former lefty, because on one hand, I'm sympathetic to the concerns of just cutting welfare like all at once, just like a flip of a switch and it's done. There are people who rely on Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security and disability and all these things, and they would definitely be harmed. And to some extent, I'm not an expert on this. I know Javier Milei in Argentina has somewhat been, you could say, like hawkish on cutting welfare, and there's been at least claims that's been detrimental to a lot of people. And yeah, sure, we don't want people on welfare, at least state welfare long term. We want them to be productive, but some people, and I'm sympathetic to this, say you should have a phase out more than just a rapid cut. And like for some people are just like they're going to live the rest of their lives on these things, but you hope to get to the point where the next generation and the ones before that are getting off of these things. But as much as I'm sympathetic to the human cost of cutting welfare, at the end of the day, it does more harm than good because it does keep people trapped in a place of dependency, and that's degenerate, right? They're not finding ways generally to be productive. And beyond that, beyond just, I don't mean just productive economically, but that's certainly one way. And then beyond that, it's then easier when you don't have to work to survive. So now you're you don't have, you're not, again, not being incentivized to think about the future. And then on top of that, there are a lot of there are natural consequences to sin, right? A lot of that can be offset. Like the consequences of sin can be offset when the government is subsidizing your lifestyle in all these different ways, right? So, and this is why this gets into so many things that I just don't have time to talk about. And so my mind's like racing towards like so many different threads I could pull on. This is part of why the war on poverty that Lyndon Johnson launched has been destructive to minority communities. You can make it all right when the left talks about systemic racism, which definitely existed in the past and maybe doesn't quite exist in the same way it does today, although the effects are still felt. But you could argue welfare is almost, at least you could say it was founded almost as a subtle, like very like wolf in sheep's clothing version of systemic racism, because it's only led to worse and worse outcomes for minority communities over time. So anyway, this is stuff Hoppe talks about, and it just, so like the point I make to Andrew is that all of this just demonstrates that you not only should we care more about the violence and distortion of the state, because it's far more destructive to human society and creates far more degeneracy in that way, based on my definition of it, but also again, that's why I said earlier, sexual degeneracy is more, it would still exist without the state, but the sort of like rise of sexual degeneracy and some of the like really like crazy stuff from like the LGBT community. I'm sorry, but I think without welfare, without the sort of like economic incentives, without public education, like all of these things are creating this bubble of degeneracy in our society. It's like artificially, the same way that like the Fed with interest rates artificially lowering them and printing money, it inflates these bubbles in the economy. And then so a lot of people buy houses, right? And then the value of houses go up, artificial, these bubbles. Like you can say that's kind of what's happening with a lot of the LGBT stuff, is that it is being artificially stimulated by the state. I think because the state is ultimately a degenerative institution, it's inevitably going to lead, the incentive structures are to lead towards that. They lend towards that outcome. So if you want to deal with sexual degeneracy, first thing you need to do is wipe out the apparatus, which is far worse than sexual degeneracy for society, and that also worsens the problem of sexual degeneracy. I'm going to set a record for how many times I've said the word in a short period of time. So let me pause here. I see some comments. Cody said, from a Christian perspective, what should our response be to consensual acts of sexual degeneracy versus acts of non-consensual violence? How about people who commit either of these acts? I'm not sure I get the question. Let me read it again. Christian perspective wants to be to consensual acts of sexual degeneracy versus acts of non-consensual violence. Yeah, I think we need to preach the gospel to people who are living in sin. And then after that, like, that's all you can do. I would say, even Cody, you're Anabaptist, but I'm sure you would mostly agree with me, even though we don't share the same soteriology, that you can't argue people out of their sin or even argue them necessarily into accepting Christ that to varying degrees, we all agree that takes an act of the Spirit. And then the Spirit is what convicts us of sin and sanctifies us. And the church plays a role in that, and our fellow believers play a role in that. But that's our response to it, right? It's not force, and it's not, I don't even think it's really ostracism, although there's things in the Bible about not being unequally yoked. And so I think with non believers, you have to approach relationships in terms of friendships and business. And especially, I'm not legalistic about this, but I'm probably a step removed from being legalistic about getting married to non-believers. But yeah, ultimately, I don't think the solution is generally ostracism. It's a libertarian tool, but I don't know that's the Christian tool. There's actually there's more of a scriptural mandate to use ostracism for unrepentant believers than for unrepentant non-believers. And then for bring his comment back up, for the acts of non-consensual violence, because I guess consensual violence is like boxing matches. But yeah, I would say, obviously, towards violence, we need to be interceding to stop that. And even you as a pacifist, Cody, would agree there's at least a legitimate use of some force to stop that. And yeah, I think we should be more strongly condemning those who engage in acts of violence than those who engage in consensual acts of sexual sin. So Cody said, yeah, my Anabaptist take would be that we preach the gospel to both, but also that there's a legitimate function performed by government against the violent, but not other kind of sinners. Yeah, I would agree with that. So Cody says, I also concur with what you said about ostracizing sinners within the community. Paul says we judge inside the church and leave the outsider to God. Yeah, I agree with that. Again, these are general principles, which then you find out application is always messy, and it's a little bit of talking things out with fellow believers, doing things like I've talked about this with our church. We have different like guidelines and procedures in our church bylaws and things like that for how to deal with this stuff. But yeah, you never want to be rash with any of this. But yeah, there are slow, reasonable, and yet firm in love ways to respond to unrepentant sin within the church. And you use ostracism as like kind of the last resort when you've exhausted everything else. So I want to focus a little bit more on, I just want to end on explaining why war is the health of the state, right? That's what we as libertarians talk about. And war creates all sorts of blowbacks and distortions. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I am pro-life. I am pro-life when it comes to babies in the womb, and I am pro-life to babies and children and men and women living in Gaza and living in Iran, living anywhere, right? So it's the same basic argument, right? A human life is a human life no matter where it is, whether it's in a mother's womb or it happens to be in Gaza or some Middle Eastern country. And beyond just the economic and obvious like human life cost of war is closely tied to this collectivist nationalist mind virus that causes us to abandon morality and to abandon our viewing every individual as created in the image of God, and instead reinforces the bug in our human consciousness that's caused by sin, where it causes us to dehumanize the people that that we view as our enemy, right? And that is so destructive, like beyond the economics, beyond the life impact. It's destructive to the most important thing we do as Christians. The most important thing we do as Christians. And there's a lot of important things that we all do with our lives. Raising my children is one of the most important things I do with my life. It's more important than what I do on this podcast, or how many good things come out of any kind of evangelism I do. Raising my kids is probably like the most important thing I do. But even more important than that, not that, again, this doesn't make this stuff less important, but just higher than that is my call to be a citizen of the kingdom of heaven, an ambassador living here on earth, a sojourner in this world, proclaiming the kingdom of God, proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ and the good news of salvation that comes in him. And when we identify as Christians, and we're proclaiming that message, but then we conflate it with the dehumanization that comes with war and nationalism. We do violence upon the gospel message. And considering the gospel message is the only thing that can save, the only thing that can truly bring life, that brings eternal life, I can't imagine anything more degenerative than any action which would take anything away from our ability to be good witnesses and have good testimonies for that gospel. And that is why I focus so much on war. And dehumanization happens in other areas too, which is also important, right? Racism is, of course, a form of dehumanization, right? And to some extent, I thought racism was dead, but it's almost starting to reemerge in certain corners of the right and left in certain ways. And so we have to speak out against that too. But war is when you know that the various ways in which dehumanization happens, when it's I'm trying to think, like, it's the outward manifestation that it's become, like, it's risen the toxic levels, right? Because at the end of the day, like, all the government propaganda in the world, it's aimed at what? It's aimed at causing you to, it's generally aimed at dehumanizing the other side. And they do that through different ways. They do that through fear. They do that through outright lying. They do that through racism. They do that through various forms of bigotry. They do that through kind of like this national identity. They do that through distorting Christian theology, right? With things like hyper dispensationalism, or even like weird hyper post-millennialism that makes white people the superior race or something like that. I don't know. There's some weird people out there, man, distorting Christian theology in all sorts of ways. But all of that is the most degenerate. Those are all the worst, the most blatant forms of degeneracy that exist, I think. Because at the end of the day, while the dominion mandate matters, while we live on this earth, while we are waiting for the second coming, we still live with the effects of the fall. And we can't fully live out that dominion mandate. Because as it said in Genesis 3, one of the effects of the fall is that our efforts here on this earth are going to be thwarted by the effects of sin. That our work is going to be hard, and we're going to toil, and even when we're working in the fields, that we're going to be fighting thorns, and just like everything is going to resist us, right? And sin is always going to cause even the best efforts to create a free and a moral society to fall short. And it doesn't mean we don't get better over time. I think we have seen progress over time, but it's never perfect, and there's always peaks and valleys and reversions, and nothing lasts forever. There is no utopia here on earth, because we're awaiting, just as we as individuals are being sanctified for eternity, creation also longs to be sanctified and brought back to a state of restoration. And so the ultimate thing that brings life to individuals and to society is the gospel. And we have to place that at the top of our focus and our priority. Everything else falls into place when we do that. All right, everyone. I hope that you enjoyed that. I hope that made sense. Again, I think that we just conclude by saying that the thrust of this episode hopefully comes through as not trying to provide cover for sexual immorality or for degeneracy, but rather just to understand that the effects of these things, of these different sins in society and on individuals, is different, and to understand cause and effect. We can more effectively be proclaimers of the gospel and advocates for a free and moral society when we take a second to think and actually act based on a constructed worldview, that we make a hierarchy of what is important and urgent, what is important but not as urgent, and weighing the consequences of different actions, and also understanding the roles of church and state and individuals in society. And this is why I think beyond just libertarianism, but the concept of seer sovereignty, which I've talked about before, understanding the proper ordering of society, these are things which are important. So that's all I have for you guys for today's episode. Please share, subscribe, leave 5-star reviews, support the show. Go to biblicalanarchypodcast.com. And live at peace, live for Christ. Take care.
The Biblical Anarchy podcast is a part of the Christians for Liberty Network, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. If you love this podcast, it helps us reach more with a message of freedom when you rate and review us on your favorite podcast apps and share with others. If you want to support the production of the Biblical Anarchy podcast, please consider donating to the Libertarian Christian Institute at biblicalanarchypodcast.com, where you can also sign up to receive special announcements and resources related to biblical anarchy. Thanks for tuning in.